Today, today's class we are looking at 10.1, which is movement and muscle tissue. So there's three types of muscle tissue. There is skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle cells. So let's look at skeletal muscle cells first. Skeletal muscle cells, they are striated and tubular. So here you can see the striations, or like these stripes, and they're tubular. So we can see like this tube-like structures. They have many nuclei. So notice here, there's a nuclei present, more than one. They contract voluntarily, meaning they are under your control, your conscious control, and they are usually attached to bones of the skeleton. Next, we have the smooth muscle cells. So smooth muscle cells are non-striated, so we will not see that stripe-like structure we saw in skeletal muscles. They have one nucleus, and they contract involuntarily. So it's not under our conscious control. And these are found in the walls of internal organs. So think of like the intestines. And next is the cardiac muscle cells. These are striated, they are tubular, and they are also branched. They have one nucleus, they contract involuntarily, and they are only found in the walls of the heart. So because it's named cardiac, cardiac refers to heart. These are only found in the heart. All right, so just again, the three types of muscles in our body. There's striated, non-striated, and cardiac. So food moves through the intestines and blood moves through blood vessels by the contractions of our smooth muscles, which were the non-striated muscles. The heart, it's a continually working muscle, and it beats because of the specialized cardiac muscle. And then lastly, muscles that facilitate movement, like our biceps, our abdominals, our moving, our legs, and so on. They're skeletal, which are also striated muscles. The major difference between smooth, the non-striated muscles, and cardiac or striated skeletal muscles is how they contract. So smooth muscles are said to constrict or dilate, while the cardiac and striated skeletal muscles contract by shortening or lengthening. And constriction and dilation are still contractions, but of hollow organs such as the intestines. So let's take a look at the functions of the skeletal muscles. So the functions include that the skeletal muscle, it supports the body, so it has a supportive role. The contraction of skeletal muscle, it opposes the force of gravity. It enables us to stand upright and remain upright. Skeletal muscle makes the bones move, so it's the muscle contraction accounts for the movement of our arms, our legs, our eyes, for facial expressions, as well as breathing. Skeletal muscle helps to maintain a constant body temperature because skeletal muscle contraction causes ATP to break down, which releases a lot of heat, which then gets distributed throughout the body. Skeletal muscles also help to protect the internal organs and stabilize the joints. So skeletal muscle pads, the bones that protect the organs. It also has tendons that help to hold the bones together at the joints. So that's what tendons do. So here we're looking at the cooperation of skeletal muscles. So when muscles contract, they shorten. Muscles can only pull, they cannot push. So work is done during contraction. Muscles that permit movement of the skeleton are present in pairs. So basically for the action of each muscle, there is another muscle that has the opposite action. So for example, biceps and triceps. Biceps The bicep muscle causes the arm to flex or bend. So there's the bicep muscle, and the muscle shortens. At the same time, we can see that the tricep muscle is relaxed. And then when you lengthen your arm, the bicep muscle is relaxed, the tricep muscle is contracting. So the contraction of opposites is how we see this movement. All right, so just again here, to lengthen, a muscle must relax so that an opposing force can pull the muscle back to its full length. So we have that opposing pair of muscles around a joint. The joint is basically the fulcrum, and it allows muscles to act together to stretch each other. It also allows muscles to provide the force to move a bone, which is in effect a lever in opposite directions. So skeletal muscle consists of bundles of fibers. All right, so here we have bone, we have the tendon, connective tissue, and here we see our muscle right here. So the hierarchy of muscle structure, we have the muscle, and then we have the muscle fiber bundle shown here, and then we have a muscle fiber. Then we have the myofibrils, and then we have the myofilaments. So a muscle is composed of many muscle fibers. The muscle fibers are made of myofibrils, which are composed of two kinds of myofilaments, which we'll talk about further. All right, muscle function and structure. So whatever the type and function, all muscle tissues are specialized, so they are capable of shortening and producing a motion. Because of the sizable energy required for muscle contraction, a significant amount of heat is released during the process. So as a result of these two characteristics, the ability to contract and generate heat as a byproduct of their metabolism, muscles serve a number of functions. So we talked about support and movement, also the propulsion of blood through vessels, especially in the legs, the movement of food or body secretions through tracts, thermoregulation, or the ability to regulate body temperature. Like I said, a tendon, it attaches each end of a muscle to a different bone. So like we saw before in the previous diagram, muscle would display groups of muscle fiber bundles. These bundles are clustered further, and they're wrapped in a layer of connective tissue and supplied with nerves and blood vessels. And muscle cells have these specialized contractile proteins called actin and myosin. All right, so some components of the skeletal muscle fibers. So the muscle fiber, it's a single muscle cell. It's responsible for the muscle contractions. Myoglobin, this is an oxygen binding pigment. It's similar to hemoglobin, and it's found in the skeletal muscle fiber, and it stores oxygen for use during muscle contractions. The sarcolemma is the membrane of a muscle fiber. So the cell membrane of a muscle fiber is called a sarcolemma. And it surrounds the muscle fiber. It regulates the entry and exit of materials. So just like a cell membrane. Then we have the sarcoplasm. This is the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber. So it has a special name. Instead of cytoplasm in the muscle cell, it's called sarcoplasm. This is the site of metabolic processes for normal cell activities. It contains the myoglobin. It also contains glycogen, which stores energy for muscle contractions. Then we have a sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's the smooth endoplasmic reticulum in a muscle fiber. It stores calcium ions needed for muscle contractions. Next, we have myofibrils. These are those organized bundles of myofilaments that we saw in the previous diagram. They're cylindrical structures as long as the muscle fiber itself, and they contain the myofilaments that are responsible for muscle contractions. Then we have a thick filament. This is the fine myofilament composed of bundles of protein called myosin. They're about 11 nanometers in diameter. These will bind to actin and will cause the muscle contractions. And then there's the thin filament. That's the fine myofilament composed of strands of protein called actin. And this will bind to myosin and cause muscle contractions. So we'll take a look at the mechanism of muscle fiber contractions. So muscle contractions involve the coordinated action of these two types of myofilaments, the actin and the myosin. So the thinner actin myofilament, it consists of two strands of protein called the actin that are wrapped around each other, kind of like beads. Okay, so this is what the actin or the thin myofilament looks like. And then we have a thick myosin myofilament, and it also consists of two strands of protein molecules wound around each other. It's about 10 times longer than an actin filament, and it has a different shape. One end of a myosin myofilament consists of a long rod. The other end consists of a double-headed globular region. It's called the head. So if we look here, this is the myosin molecule. It's wound around, and there's the myosin heads here and here. All right, and all together like this, it's the myosin, the thick myofilament. All right, so just again, the actin myofilament is the thin one, composed of globular actin proteins. And then the myosin myofilament composed of myosin molecules. Each myosin molecule consists of two polypeptide chains that are wrapped around each other. The end of each chain has this structure that's called the head. The thick myofilaments are composed of bundles of myosin molecules, and so the heads will protrude at regular intervals. All right, so how do myofilaments contract? So when a myofilament contracts, the heads of the myosin move first. The heads bend backward and inward. Okay, and because the heads are attached at this time to an actin myofilament, shown here, they're attached, the actin is pulled along with the myosin heads as they flex. So as a result, the actin myofilament will slide past the myosin myofilament in the direction of the flex, and ATP is required for this to occur. So here in figure A, the myosin head attaches to the actin right here. This is the myosin myofilament. This is the actin myofilament. The myosin head flexes, advancing the actin filament. Okay, it's moved backward and inward. The myosin head releases and unflexes, and this is all powered by ATP. The myosin will then reattach to actin farther along the fiber, and then this process will repeat. All right, and the sliding filament model. So just like we saw previously, so the actin is anchored at one end of each myofilament at a position in striated muscle tissue called the Z-line. Okay, shown here. The movement of actin also moves the Z-line together because they are anchored together. As actin moves past myosin, it drags the Z-line towards the myosin, and both actin myofilaments are being pulled inward, and then contraction will occur. So just going through this figure, the ends on the two ends of the myosin filament, they're oriented in opposite directions. When the heads attach to the actin, they bend towards the center of the myosin. As one end of the myosin filament draws the actin filament and its attached Z-line towards the center, the other end of the myosin filament does the same. Both the Z-lines move towards the center. Here's the center. They both moved inwards. and contraction occurs. So that is the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. Okay, so this is just another diagram showing muscle contraction again. So in its most basic form, it involves the interaction of those two types of myofilaments, the actin and the myosin. It's called the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. So the sarcomere, it's the region of overlapping actin and myosin myofilaments. It shortens in response to muscle stimulation. The sarcomere repeats itself along the length of skeletal and cardiac muscle fibers. Each sarcomere, it's bound by those Z lines that will ultimately move towards each other when the thin actin myofilament moves past the thicker myosin myofilament. The actin myofilament pulls on the ends of the region of contraction, and it does require ATP. And the other point here is how we see those striations. It's the shortening of the sarcomere and the change in the various zones and bands that make up the sarcomere. That's what makes the skeletal muscles striated. All right, so we're going to stop here today. Next class, we'll look at calcium ions and their role in contraction.